You meet someone, and at first it's electric. You're texting all day, they seem interested, you're excited, but somewhere along the line, they start pulling back. And what do? You chase. You overthink every text. You get anxious. You wonder if you did something wrong. But then one day, you meet someone who's even more distant than your usual type, and something strange happens. You stop chasing, you stop reaching out, you start matching their energy, and suddenly, you've become the avoidant. But here's where it gets interesting. That silence, that emotional distance you used to fight so hard against starts to reveal something. You start to see the pattern, you feel the emptiness. And for the first time, you're not just reacting, you're reflecting. You realize the people you were drawn to weren't feeding your soul, they were feeding your anxiety. And now that there's no one to pull the closeness out of, you start asking better questions. Not, how can I get them back? But why was I trying so hard in the first place? The anxious individuals often find themselves in a repeating cycle when it comes to relationships. They crave connection, intimacy, and reassurance, deeply and intensely. Their emotional world is rich and constantly seeking confirmation that they are safe, loved, and valued. This isn't weakness. It's rooted in a fear of abandonment, a fear that if they don't try hard enough or give enough, they'll lose the person they care about. So when they enter into a relationship, they naturally gravitate toward people who are a little more distant, a little more reserved, people who don't express their emotions freely or seem to need space when things get too close. At first, this dynamic can feel like a challenge. The avoidant partner may seem mysterious, self-assured, independent, qualities that the anxious person finds both attractive and comforting. They believe that if they can just win over this person, it'll finally prove they're lovable. They convince themselves that their ability to bring someone emotionally unavailable into a place of closeness would somehow validate their worth. But over time, this dynamic becomes a breeding ground for insecurity. The anxious person starts to notice that every time they reach out, they get less back. They send long, thoughtful texts and receive short, delayed replies. They initiate plans and are met with vague commitments. They express vulnerability and are met with emotional shutdowns. Instead of feeling connected, they begin to feel like they're chasing someone who's always just out of reach. That constant pursuit feeds their anxiety and wires their nervous system to believe that love is something they have to work for, something they have to earn by being less needy, more patient, more understanding, more accommodating. What's particularly challenging is that the more the anxious person gives, the more the avoidant retreats. It's like trying to hug a shadow. The closer they move, the more it disappears. The anxious partner begins to confuse inconsistency with passion. They start mistaking emotional unavailability for depth, because in those rare moments when the avoidant shows affection or engagement, it feels euphoric, like a hit of dopamine. But that high is short-lived, and soon they're back in the low, wondering what they did wrong, questioning whether they were too much, whether they pushed too hard. This cycle reinforces the anxious person's belief that their emotional needs are unreasonable. They start shrinking themselves, pulling back, trying to be cooler, quieter, less intense. But deep down, they're not okay. They're emotionally starving, and in that starvation, they start to lose themselves. They stop expressing what they want. They become hyper-focused on how to avoid upsetting the other person. They walk on eggshells, and eventually, they start to believe that if they just hold on long enough, things will get better. That patience will be rewarded with love. The reality is, anxious people are often taught, either through past relationships or early life experiences, that they have to earn closeness. That love is a prize they only get if they perform. So when they meet someone avoidant, it unconsciously mirrors the pattern they know. It feels familiar. The emotional distance doesn't just frustrate them, it activates them. It lights up all their insecurities, all their fears, and all their hopes that maybe this time it'll be different. Maybe this time there'll finally be enough to make someone stay. And so they continue chasing what's inconsistent, hoping it turns into something stable. But the truth is, anxious people don't fall for avoidance by accident. They fall because at some level they believe that love is about effort, that the more you chase it, the more you deserve it. That if you finally get the avoidant person to open up, you'll finally feel like you're lovable. And that belief is what keeps them stuck. When an anxious person begins to turn avoidant, it's rarely because they've suddenly stopped caring. It's almost never because their need for connection has disappeared. What's really happening is a protective shift, a subconscious strategy to shield themselves from pain. After repeatedly feeling rejected, neglected, or emotionally dismissed, the anxious person starts to internalize a dangerous message that expressing their needs leads to disappointment. So instead of reaching out, they begin to pull back. Instead of asking for reassurance, they stay silent. It may look like they've stopped caring, but what they've actually done is start building walls in the name of self-preservation. This shift is often misunderstood by the anxious person themselves. They may tell themselves they're just tired of always being the one to initiate, that they're setting boundaries, that they're finally learning not to overgive. And while some of that may be true, much of the withdrawal isn't coming from a place of empowerment. It's coming from exhaustion. They've been running on empty for so long, trying to keep a connection alive with someone who keeps their emotional cards close to their chest, that they eventually burn out. The reaching out becomes too painful. The silence they get in return starts to sting more than the hope they used to hold on to. So they shut down, they retreat, they match the avoidant energy, not because it feels good, but because it feels safer than vulnerability. At this stage, the anxious person can often feel confused about their own behavior. They don't feel like themselves. They miss the version of them that was open, expressive, and emotionally available. But after so many unanswered texts, so many moments of vulnerability met with discomfort or distance, they've learned to quiet their voice. They're not stepping into a new identity. They're hiding from their old one because it kept getting hurt. And yet, on the surface, it can look like growth. People around them might even say things like, "Wow, you're finally playing it cool," or "Good for you for not caring so much." But inside, the anxious person knows that this so-called detachment is laced with pain. They still care deeply. They still feel everything. They've just chosen to stop expressing it because it's been too costly. This internal conflict creates a lot of tension. There's a part of them that still wants closeness, still craves intimacy, but there's also a rising voice saying, "Don't get too close again. Don't risk it." So now they live in limbo. They're stuck between wanting love and fearing it. They tell themselves they've grown, that they've moved on, that they're no longer desperate for connection. But they know the truth. This isn't growth. It's a coping mechanism. It's emotional numbing disguised as emotional maturity. And the longer they stay in this state, the harder it becomes to recognize their own needs. What complicates things further is that the avoidant partner often doesn't notice this shift in the way the anxious person hopes. There's no moment of sudden clarity where the other person realizes they're losing something valuable. Instead, the avoidant often welcomes the space. They don't interpret the anxious person's silence as strength or maturity. They just see it as relief. And that can feel like another kind of heartbreak. The anxious person finally stops reaching out, thinking maybe this time it'll spark some sort of response, some effort, some emotional wake-up call. But when nothing comes back, it confirms their fear that they were always the one trying harder. This reinforces their decision to stay distant. They stop asking for more, not because they don't want it, but because they believe they won't get it. They tell themselves that needing less is the solution, that emotional independence means not expecting anything from anyone. And so what starts as a self-defense becomes a new identity. But deep down, they still feel the ache. The need never really went away. It just went silent. When an anxious person ends up in a relationship with someone who is also avoidant, it often creates an emotional standoff. At first, it might feel like a breath of fresh air. There's no immediate pressure, no emotional chaos, no overwhelming push and pull dynamic. For a moment, the anxious individual might think they've finally found peace. But what they've really stepped into is a mirror, one that silently reflects back every unmet need they've ignored, every emotional compromise they've made, and every suppressed desire they've tried to rationalize away. In a typical anxious avoidant dynamic, the anxious person compensates for the emotional distance by doing more, reaching out more, caring more, giving more. They fill the silence, initiate the conversations, and carry the emotional weight of the connection. It's exhausting, but it gives them the illusion of control. It allows them to believe that if they just keep trying, they can make the relationship work. But when they're with someone who's just as emotionally unavailable as they are now pretending to be or have become out of protection, There's no one left to make the effort. Suddenly, they find themselves in a space where no one is chasing, no one is initiating, and no one is willing to be emotionally exposed. That space, though quiet, becomes deeply uncomfortable. There's no longer a distraction from the internal longing. Without the emotional ping-pong of hot and cold behavior, the anxious person is left alone with their thoughts, and those thoughts become loud. They start to feel the emptiness they were previously too busy to notice. They begin to recognize the hollowness of interactions that lack vulnerability, the frustration of shallow communication, and the ache of being emotionally unseen. The absence of connection forces them to confront how much they've neglected their own emotional needs in previous relationships. What's especially powerful about this realization is that it doesn't come from a dramatic breakup or explosive argument. It comes from stillness. It's in the quiet moments, the unanswered messages, and the emotionally flat conversations that they begin to see the truth. They start asking themselves questions they've avoided for years. Why do I keep choosing people who can't meet me emotionally? Why have I worked so hard to make one-sided relationships feel mutual? Why have I always been afraid to ask for more, to expect more, to need more? And perhaps most importantly, when did I start believing that this was the best I could get? Being with someone who is also avoidant holds up a painful but necessary mirror. It doesn't just show them the emotional starvation, they feel it. And when there's no partner trying to fix it, no dynamic to analyze, no mixed signals to decode, they're left to sit with the raw truth. They've been starving themselves emotionally for a long time, hoping someone would eventually notice and feed them what they need. But now that someone is just as distant as they are, there's no more illusion of progress, no more hope that their effort will be returned. This clarity doesn't come with anger at the other person. It often comes with a deep, almost heartbreaking understanding of themselves. The anxious person begins to see the pattern they've repeated, the reaching, the hoping, the self-abandonment. They realize how long they've been trying to convince themselves that being low maintenance or cool or unbothered was a form of strength, when in reality, it was fear wearing a mask, fear of being too much, fear of being rejected, fear of needing more than someone was willing to give. And now, standing across from someone who gives nothing, they begin to recognize just how much they've settled for. Emotional starvation doesn't announce itself loudly. It creeps in quietly, gradually, until it becomes the new normal. When an anxious person finds themselves in a relationship with someone who is equally avoidant, or perhaps even more so, the silence becomes deafening. In their previous patterns, there was always some form of emotional exchange, however inconsistent. The anxious individual would reach out, and eventually, the avoidant would respond. Maybe not in the way they hoped, but there was at least something to grasp onto. That tiny glimpse of connection would keep them going, giving them enough hope to justify staying, trying, and giving more of themselves. But when they meet someone whose avoidant tendencies match or exceed their own retreat, the usual coping mechanisms no longer work. There is no emotional breadcrumb to follow, no small win to hang on to. It's just a vacuum, and for the first time, they feel the full weight of emotional deprivation. That vacuum becomes a turning point. There are no dramatic fights to analyze, no emotionally charged makeups to romanticize, no gestures of affection to replay in their minds as reassurance. There's just stillness, and in that stillness, the anxious person starts to notice how empty they feel. They notice how long it's been since they felt truly seen, heard, or valued in the relationship. They become hyper-aware of the silence, of the absence of care, and of the way they've been emotionally shrinking just to maintain a connection that no longer gives anything back. The experience of emotional starvation is often more painful than outright rejection. Rejection is at least a response. It confirms something. Emotional starvation, on the other hand, leaves someone in limbo. It's an unanswered question that keeps echoing, a constant wondering whether they're being too sensitive, too needy, or too dramatic for even noticing the lack. And because anxious individuals are often quick to blame themselves, they internalize the silence as a reflection of their inadequacy. They think, if I were better, more interesting, more lovable, this person would engage. But what they begin to see in the silence of mutual avoidance is that the issue isn't their worth. It's the emotional dynamic itself. The emotional drought brings with it a kind of clarity that can't be achieved through conversation. It's not something that's explained, it's something that's felt. Day by day, the anxious person begins to connect the dots. They see how they've romanticized distance, how they've mistaken emotional unavailability for emotional depth, how they've told themselves that patience, endurance, and unconditional giving were signs of love rather than signs of self-abandonment. And without the usual distractions of emotional drama, they're forced to sit with what they've ignored, the aching feeling of not being emotionally held. What makes this even more revealing is the contrast. They remember how much they used to give, how many times they tried to express themselves, how often they tolerated neglect under the guise of understanding the other person's wounds. And now, with no energy left to chase and no emotional response coming in return, they see just how imbalanced the relationship has been. They begin to question why they ever thought it was okay to feel alone in a partnership, why they rationalized being emotionally starved as part of the normal ebb and flow of relationships, why they accepted inconsistency as a substitute for love. That emotional void becomes a spotlight. It illuminates all the ways they've compromised themselves in the past, watering down their needs, minimizing their feelings, over-explaining their emotions just to avoid being labeled as clingy or intense. Now, without the emotional ping-pong of reaction and response, they feel the full cost of those compromises. And in that space, the realization begins to grow, not through logic, but through experience. That connection without emotional nourishment isn't connection at all. It's performance. It's survival. It's hoping someone will notice you starving while you smile and say you're fine. Clarity often doesn't come from talking about what you want. It comes from experiencing what you don't. For someone with an anxious attachment style, the pursuit of connection can become so habitual, so automatic, that they rarely pause to ask themselves if what they're chasing is even what they need. The emotional highs and lows, the anticipation, the confusion, they become part of a cycle that feels like love because it's intense. But when that intensity fades, when they finally stop chasing or meet someone who gives even less than they've ever experienced, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Suddenly, they're not in a push-pull dynamic anymore. They're in an emotional dead zone. And in that stillness, a realization starts to emerge, one they've been avoiding for a long time.